All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome to our second online lecture. Today, what we're going to be talking about primarily is hypotheses. And you're going to be developing your own hypotheses, as we talked about, for your main research project in the class. So we're going to talk about hypotheses today, and then we'll have our activity in class regarding hypotheses. But before we even get to that, I want to talk a little bit about the reaction paper, your first assignment in here. And so here is how the reaction paper works. You're going to read this article by Thomas Szasz called The Myth of Mental Illness. There's also a summary article to read by Germov and Frege. The summary article is optional. So the summary article is really just there to supplement the information about the main article. The main article can be a little tough to read. It's a little bit funky that way. So if you're having a struggle with the main article, use that summary article to help you out. Okay, so once you've read it, and you're probably going to want to read it a couple times just to make sure you really have the information, you're going to summarize the article in about a paragraph. And then the bulk of your reaction paper is going to be to analyze and evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of the article. Now, to help you, to give you a framework for analyzing the strengths and weaknesses, I want you to use the methods for acquiring knowledge. Remember that from the last lecture? So if not, look back, but we talked about the methods for acquiring knowledge. And what does Szasz use? Intuition, authority, rationalism, empiricism, a combination. So kind of look through each one of those four and think about what Szasz actually uses in his article to make his points. And then finally, the third section of this paper is your reaction. Did you agree, disagree with the article? What questions does it bring up for you? What insights does it bring up for you? And there's really no right or wrong with respect to your reaction, okay? Just looking for you to have an informed opinion. And then also don't forget to cite your sources using APA style, okay? And we'll talk a little bit more, a touch more about APA style as we go forward. So remember, you have those resources that were listed on the syllabus that you can use to get at APA style. To help you with that. So your sources really for this one are just going to be the two main articles and potentially your textbook, right? Unless you have some outside sources, which is perfectly fine. So you'll be in good shape for that. And of course, remember, no plagiarizing. I know that sounds like the obvious, but you'll see as we kind of go forward and talk about that topic too, that plagiarism is not such a straightforward issue as you might think, okay? So it's going to be a 2-page assignment, okay? So 2 pages long, 12-point font, double-spaced, 1-inch margins. Submit on D2L by the deadline posted. And also, please be aware of the format. No pages. The pages format does not really work for me. You can use docx. If you're really stuck, you can make it a PDF. But I really prefer doc and docx, really the Word formats. Now, if you do use pages, there is a way to convert from that to doc or docx. So that's how you're going to do it. You're going to submit it on D2L by the deadline. And here's the thing. Let's say it's 11 o'clock at night, D2L shuts down on you. I don't expect this to happen, but crazy things happen, right? So email your submission as a last resort. Get it to me somehow, okay? Take a picture of it, send that to me, whatever you have to do, but get it in by the deadline. And don't email me at 11 o'clock saying, hey, should I submit this via email? No, because I probably won't respond because I'll probably be asleep. So just go ahead and email it if you're really stuck. And then we'll work out together how to get it onto D2L for you, okay? But please do submit it on D2L unless you run into that sort of last minute emergency. Okay. So now we can actually talk about hypotheses. Actually, before we do that, I just want to say one more word. There will be a rubric posted for you with a little more details, so please look out for the rubric as well on this reaction paper, okay? All right, so now hypotheses. Now let's talk about hypotheses a little bit. Okay, so in order to talk about hypotheses, which is really your proposed idea for a study, what you propose the outcome will be, before we talk about that, let's talk about our sources of research ideas. Where do we come up with our research ideas? Okay, because that's going to be part of what you're doing, is coming up with a research idea. So one area we come up with research ideas from is just common sense in everyday life. This is kind of similar to the intuition we were talking about the other day. You know, just things like you think of absence makes the heart grow fonder. You've heard that phrase. You wonder if that's true. And so maybe you want to compare uh, the relationships of people who are in long distance relationships versus those who see each other every day, and look at the success or failure of those relationships, or look at the quality of those relationships. And so you can compare your two groups, those who tend to be in long distance relationships, those who tend to be in everyday see each other relationships, and look at the quality of those relationships in both groups and see who has the higher quality. Okay, that's just off, the top of our head. That's something that would relate to common sense or everyday life. How about observation or practical issues? Wow, well, that brings up a lot of possibilities too. For example, cell phone use. How does cell phone use impact our mental health? Do people who use their cell phones more report lower quality of life? Or the opposite, do they report higher quality of life? Or maybe cell phone is too broad. Maybe we'll just look at media, social media, and see how that impacts our feelings, our quality of life. Or maybe that's not really your thing. Maybe you're more interested in understanding about new therapy techniques for post-traumatic stress disorder. Maybe, especially now in times of COVID, you're interested in how social distancing impacts us. Okay, so could be observation or practical issues. Okay, theory is a great way that we get ideas for research. And I invite you now to just take a moment and think about what are some theories that you know about from psychology. And if you've already had a personality class, maybe that will be helpful, because there's a lot of theories in personality. So feel free to pause, take a moment, think about that. And I want to give you a couple of examples. So for example, there's Freud's theory of psychosexual development, right? We have the oral stage and the phallic stage and the latency stage, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe you'd want to test that theory. Maybe you just want to test for part of that theory. What does the oral stage really look like? What does that really imply for adulthood? Those sort of things. Or you could look at Eysenck's theory of personality. Or maybe you really like the big five theory of personality, right? The neuroticism, extroversion, openness, agreeableness, and conscientiousness, right? That's by Costa and McCrae. They propose those are the 5 main things you want to look at with big five personality. And maybe you're curious, okay, so if people are more open, what implication does that have for solving puzzles? Do people who have a more open personality, are they better at solving certain kinds of puzzles? Maybe, maybe not, but that's something you could test. And finally, of course, past research. Past research is one of our biggest sources for ideas about future research. So if you want to come up with an interesting new idea about research, go to the literature, see what's been done in the past. I want to know if music ability and mathematical ability are really related. So I'm going to look at past research about these two things and see how people have looked at that question in the past, what kind of methodology they've used, and what have they found. And what's something new that they haven't asked that I can ask? Okay, because you're trying to add on to that previous research. All right, so those are some sources of research ideas. Okay, so we talked a little bit about a theory, and I want to define that a little bit more because that's an important concept. So a theory is a systematic body of ideas that explain how and why some part of the world works. Okay, so they tend to organize and explain, like the Big Five personality theory, right? It tries to organize and explain, look, these are the five main components of all of our personalities. And it also seeks to generate new knowledge, right? Now that we know these are the five big theories, if five big components of personality, if we accept that theory, what questions can we ask about that? And also, any good theory can be modified by new research. So maybe it's not about the big five. Maybe there's a big six, or maybe a big four, or maybe something else entirely. Okay, so that's theory. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about some issues that can affect research ideas. And one big one is bias. This is one we have to look out for. This is a big part of a big rationale for why we want to have such tight methodology in our studies to help prevent bias. Because bias can help us to overlook research ideas because of personal preferences or demographic influences. Right? We might just, without even being aware of our own biases, and I would argue we all have some sort of biases, we might just not investigate something. So, for example, let's say we want to look at the influence of maternal work outside the home on children's psychological welfare. Sounds interesting. But what about paternal work? What about families with one mom or two moms or one dad or two dads or something else entirely? How does this really account for those kind of families? You see, if we just kind of think of a traditional, I use that in quotes, family, maybe the question makes sense, but it may not make sense in this current era. So that's where bias can be a problem. So that's one of the things we want to watch out for. Okay. And the other important piece is that it must be capable of being scientifically investigated. In other words, it has to be able to be confirmed or refuted. Okay, so this again, I would say for the most part, this is not about specific content areas, but more about how we approach that. So for example, issues of morality or religion, right? They're really important, but they're harder. I'm not going to say you can't investigate them, because there are really good studies out there that involve religion and involve morality, but they're harder to investigate. Okay, but I'll give you an example. Let's say you're interested in cancer patients, and you want to know if, given two patients with a very similar prognosis, prediction about their outcome, will one who has religious ideas survive longer, have a longer lifespan than one without? That's something you could study. That's something you could look at. I had a student in the past who looked at how students feel about cheating in the classroom. And they had a very clever methodology for looking at that in an ethical way. So there's a lot of, in my opinion, I think you can get around a lot of issues by being creative. But in any case, it's got to be capable of either being confirmed or refuted, whatever your idea is. Okay, all right. So this brings me to ROTS. Four qualities that you would love to have in any scientific study. Now, some are absolutely critical. Some are we sometimes let go of. I'll be honest with you, because it's not possible. So let me start off with repeatable. In other words, can the study be repeated? Can you replicate the situation, the circumstances under which you're investigating this study? So in other words, if someone else, and this is something I often talk about, if someone else read your method section, read about how you did your study, could they do the exact same study? So just to throw something out there, a good example would be exposure to a list of words. Right? I want to expose someone to a list of words. Some words are going to have a positive affect to them. Some words are going to have a negative affect to them. And I want to see if whether it's positive or negative impacts how many words people remember. That would be a lovely little study. Okay. So that would be great, because that's very repeatable. Now, let's say we want to do a study regarding a natural disaster, regarding Hurricane Harvey, let's say, when that was happening. Well, the problem with that is you can't really replicate a hurricane, right? You can't really replicate the same set of circumstances. Now, one might argue that, yeah, but if another hurricane comes along, we could kind of compare the results, and I would tend to agree. But I want you always, especially in this class, to think about trying to do something repeatable. It doesn't mean you can't do something related to COVID if that's your interest, because we don't know. It's still technically repeatable under the same set of circumstances. But I want you to think always in terms of, could someone replicate the study? Okay. All right. Observable. This one's even more critical. And whereas repeatable, we can make some arguments. Observable, more strict. Okay. So a good example. Go back to our word example. How many words are remembered? Perfect. I can count that. I can observe that. I can understand that. Bad example. A person's information processing speed. Hard to assess, hard to measure. How do we really know what's going on in the black box of our brain? Okay. Now, we might be able to tease that out in a specific way, but we would say it differently, right? We would say we're going to assess how quickly they respond to the list of words, or we'd look at the time it takes for them to remember the words. Those sort of things. Something measurable, something observable. Okay, next one, testable. Testable. You've got to be able to test your hypothesis. This is another one that's really, really critical, less wiggle room here. A good example, does living in rural versus urban areas influence how many words are remembered? Interesting. Sure, and we can test that. We can take people in a rural area, we can take people in an urban area, and we can compare how many words each group remembers. Okay, bad example. Does living on Earth influence how many words are remembered? Well, maybe this is actually changing as time goes on, but for the most part, we pretty much all live on Earth. And so how would we ever test that? How would we ever test that? And again, you could come up and say, well, space station, and there's all these new things going on. Of course, of course. But for the most part, that one, I'm trying to come up with a bad example of something that wouldn't be really testable. Most things are, which is the good news. Okay. And finally, you want things to be specific. So this sometimes is a challenging one. So I want to go into it in more detail, and I'll actually show you a definition. A specific statement helps ensure the researcher understands the problem. Okay, and a specific problem statements help the researcher to determine factors such as participants, what instruments you need, what apparatus you need, what measures you need. So again, let me go ahead and give you kind of a bad example and a good example. So a bad example, something that would be too vague, might be, what effect does the environment have on learning ability? too vague. It's not enough information. There's about 1,000 questions I can come up with based on that very vague, broad definition. So what would be better than that? What effect does the amount of exposure to words have on the speed with which they are learned? Okay, now I'm getting specific ideas about, okay, so I need a list of words. I need to think through how I'm going to get that. I need a timer because I want to assess time. That's my piece there. So I'm starting to have some very specific ideas about how this study is going to unfold. So you want to be as specific as possible with your study, okay, when you're forming your hypotheses. All right. Feasibility of the study. This is something that also comes into play because you must always consider the time, the expense, ethical, and other issues to determine if conducting the study is possible and practical. There are many, many, many interesting studies out there that are simply just not feasible to conduct. Now, for you guys, there will be a few restrictions I give you, but you won't have to worry too much about time and expense because I am going to be creating the data for you. So as long as you're creating an ethical study, you don't have to worry too much about that kind of issue. If you want $1 million study, so be it. You create $1 million study, I will supply you with data, and you'll go from there. Okay, we'll talk more about that as we go forward, but just to throw that out there. But for most of us in the real world, we don't have $1 million to spend on every study, or any study maybe, so we got to watch out for feasibility. Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit about formulating the research problem. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is define the research problem, which is a question about the relationship between two or more variables. For example, can a group induce a person to deliver punishment of increasing severity to a protesting individual? That was actually a real study done by Milgram back, and the publication was back around 1964, as you can see here. So can a group induce a person to? And the answer was it looked like they could. If you're not familiar with this study, it basically had to do with delivering shocks. And thankfully the shocks were all fake, but the person delivering the shocks didn't know this. So basically what happened is it was kind of a rigged study in that the person who came in thought that they were either going to be assigned to be the learner or the teacher, but really the person who came in was always the teacher. And the learner would sit in a separate room, supposedly hooked up to a shock machine, a machine that would deliver electric shocks. And at the beginning, it was fine. The person would get some right, and it wasn't so bad. But each time that the person got something wrong, you were supposed to deliver a more and more severe shock. And some of the shocks were even labeled like "don't use" or XX or something like that, danger. And yet a large majority of people still delivered all of the shocks to the learner. Now, like I said, this was rigged. The learner didn't actually receive any shocks, but it still was a very ethically challenging study, and we'll talk more about that when we get into ethics. But nonetheless, this is how you'd formulate the research problem. This is how you'd ask a question. Another question: do space creatures influence the behavior of college students? Now, you already know that's a problem. That's a problematic study because of ROTS, right? It's not really observable. It's not really testable because we don't really know of any space creatures. But that is how you would formulate the research problem between two variables. Okay. So what are the criteria for a good research problem? The variable should express a relationship, right? How does this relate to that? It should be stated in question form. And it has to be capable of empirical testing, which is very, very important. And that's where our second one fails. Okay. So how does X relate to Y? Something that's in question form, something that's able to be tested. Okay. Now, formulating hypotheses. Now, this is the best prediction or a tentative solution to a problem. So remember, one thing we always want to make sure with hypotheses that it can be refuted. It can be shown to be wrong or right. It has to be testable. It has to be testable. Okay, so really this is just a statement about how we think the research will turn out. So let me give you another example with our word learning problem, right? We might say, those persons administered a list of positive affect words were able to remember more words than those persons administered a list of negative affect words, right? And we probably state it in future tense, will be able to remember more words than those administered a list of negative affect words. But that would be it. That would be the hypothesis. Okay. And you'll, like I said, in class we'll do an activity and you'll get more experience learning to formulate hypotheses. So now we come back to a concept that I think is probably familiar. I hope is maybe familiar from Sci 245, but if not, that's okay because we're going to go through it again. And it's what kinds of hypotheses are out there. And really there's two main types. There's the alternative or research hypothesis, and then there's the null hypothesis. So the alternative or research hypothesis says that the predicted relationship between the variables is true, right? So people will be able to remember more words who were given the positive affect list as compared to the negative affect list. Okay. The null is nothing. The basically no relationship, the opposite of that. So what's the opposite of people will? People will not. People will not be able to remember more words who were given the positive affect list as compared to the negative affect list. Now here's a question for you. Why is it not? So we have the alternative, and I'm going to rephrase a little bit to make it a little easier. People who are given the positive affect list will remember more words than people given the negative affect list. So why is the null not people who are given the negative affect list will remember more words than people given the positive affect list? Why don't we just flip it around? Why is that not the null? Think about it. Well, if you remember back to Sci 245, the alternative and the null have to make up the whole universe of every possibility. So that doesn't work. If we said, okay, positive will remember more than negative, and for the null, if we said negative will remember more than positive, what if they remember an equal amount? That's not covered. So the best way to get from alternative to null is to simply add the word not. Positive affect words are remembered more than negative affect words. Positive affect words are not remembered more than negative affect words. Okay, and I'm phrasing this different ways as I go through just to give you some different examples, but the idea is the same, okay? Alternative is what you believe is going to happen. Null, just add the word not, and you'll be in good shape. Okay. So I promised to talk to you a little bit more about plagiarism because this is an important topic. So let's just talk a little bit more about what plagiarism is and what plagiarism isn't. So plagiarism takes many forms, including a student who intentionally copies work from someone else, knowing full well that this is against the rules. So that one's easy. That one we kind of all know about. A student who copies an idea but fails to cite the sources of the idea because he or she does not understand how to cite sources. A student that does not realize that they cannot write the same paper that their best friend wrote about at another university. A student who turns in the same assignment for two classes. A student who unintentionally copies an idea based on something that they just read. Okay. You can even self-plagiarize, which sounds kind of crazy. And that's kind of what we were talking about here, right? With writing the same assignment for two classes. But there's other ways you can self-plagiarize. I learned about this a number of years back, but uh, it was when I was writing one of my earlier papers, okay? And I had written up the method section, and that was great. And then I had done a follow-up study using the same sort of methodology. Well, the idea is I can't just simply copy that method section into my new article and publish it somewhere else. I can't, even though it's my stuff. And that's because it's copyrighted by someone else. Someone who owns the journal that I published to now owns those words. So I can still talk about it. I just have to cite myself. I have to cite my previous article and that previous journal. Okay. Here are some good plagiarism resources for you. Okay. And if you have any questions at all about plagiarism, if you're ever concerned about it, please feel free to ask. Asking is not a rule-breaking thing in plagiarism. You're allowed to ask anything, so please always feel free to do that. Okay, and then just a couple of words about APA style. You guys are going to be using APA style throughout this course, starting with the reaction paper we talked about before. And so I have two good resources for you. I did recommend the APA publication manual. The 7th edition is out, and that's what we're going to be going off of is the 7th edition. But you can learn about that. If you don't want to get the book, that's perfectly fine. Here's a couple of good resources for you where you can learn about it. Okay. That is all I have for you guys for today. Hope you're all doing well, staying safe. I look forward to working on our hypotheses activity together, and I will see you next time.